Hi, we are reading The Wheel on the School by Maynard de Jong and pictures by Maurice Sendak. We have gotten to Chapter 8, Lina and the Upturned Boat. The third little side road that Lina went down was the worst. She had gone singing down the other two lanes to let the people, and especially the watchdogs, know that someone was approaching. Luckily, there had been someone at each house to hush the awful growlings of the watchdogs. The people on those back farms had seemed only too pleased to have a young girl come visiting them. They had exclaimed and clucked sympathetically when Lina explained the wagon wheel on the School for Storks project. Everybody had thought it the nicest idea. "Shore lies so bare and naked against its dike," one woman had said. "It sure could stand some storks to warm it up." But nobody had had a wheel to spare. "But, dearie," the woman had said, "if we had a spare wheel, you could be sure it would be on our own lonely roof. Every day I see the storks flying over. I wish I had a wheel. It's so quiet here, and storks are such company." The third dirt road seemed to have only one farmhouse, which was at its very end. There didn't seem to be a soul around. Nothing stirred in the farmyard except some chickens and a goose under a wagon. Lina wished now she'd first run to the dike before going down this road. She wished she'd come singing, but she'd been thinking about what all the nice people had said on the farms on the other two roads. Here in the awful silence was nothing but a goose and some chickens under a wagon at the end of a short drive that led into the farmyard. Lina took one step into the lane. Up in the wagon rose an enormous dog. All of a sudden, there he stood, growling and barking, with the growls running under the quick, short barks, the growling never stopping. Lina stood frozen where she'd stopped. The deep growling seemed to run along the ground at her. Her spine turned cold. She couldn't see whether the dog was tied in the wagon. What if he'd come in one leap from the wagon? What then? Nothing stirred, not a thing. Lina did not know what to do. If she turned and ran, as all her quaking body wanted to do, the dog might come tearing after her. Now at least he only watched her with hard eyes and warned her away with his awful hoarse growling. A desperate plan came to Lina. She began singing at the dog. She didn't know what else to do. It came out queer and quavery, but she sang. She forced herself to sing louder. It had to sound as if she were coming on. She sang at the dog with all her might. The surprised dog stayed on the wagon, but his ears flew erect at the shrill sound of the words that Lina sang at him. His growling had stopped. He uttered one bewildered bark, and then stood and stared in confusion, his ears pricked high. It encouraged Lina. She sang, and as she sang, she backed away. Any old song, any words. The dog couldn't know if they were right or wrong. She didn't herself. Then at last a hedgerow along the road hid the dog from sight for a moment. Lina turned and fled. She kept singing wildly and looking over her shoulder. The dog was not following her. For all that, Lina shouted her song all the way back to the dike and up the dike. On the high dike she felt safe. She dropped in a panting heap on top of the dike. Now across the fields she could see the dog. He was still on the wagon. He had not moved except to turn his body from the lane toward the dike. His hard eyes still seemed to look at her. Lina shuddered. Lina knew she could never nerve herself to go down another lane to another farmhouse. Never. Her throat felt scratchy and raw from her hard singing. She never wanted to sing that song again either, whatever it had been. All she knew was that she felt sweetly safe here on the dike. Nothing could take you by surprise. You could see anything coming. She looked away from the dog and out over the quiet sea behind the dike. The tide was out. The water shimmered in the far distance. But below the dike the sea bottom stretched hard and dry in the ebb tide. With loud, alarmed squawks, a heron flew up from the dry sea. It fluttered awkwardly, then came to rest on an old, upturned boat lying far out from the dike. The heron stood silhouetted against the high blue sky and the faraway blue of the water. It preened its feathers. A heron wasn't a stork, but Lina stared fascinated at the lone bird on the lonely, forsaken boat. Teacher had said to look where a wheel couldn't possibly be. Well, a wheel couldn't possibly be in a boat, especially not under a stranded, overturned boat that had been lying there upside down for years. It had been lying there as long as history. A boat must certainly be the last place for a wagon wheel, but in such places, Teacher had said, the unexpected could happen, could come up to surprise you. And there were no dogs in the sea. Slowly Lina crossed the dry strand, skirting the few puddles left in hollow places from the last flood tide. Even as quietly as Lina came, the heron heard her. With a loud, disagreeable squawk, it flapped up and flew away over the dike. Lina was alone in the silent, dry stretches of the mysterious sea. Before her loomed the dark, old boat. It was difficult to know how to climb to the top of the high, round-bottomed fishing boat. Why she wanted to get on the boat, Lina didn't exactly know, except that now she was here, it seemed she had to do something. She couldn't just walk around it and walk back to sit on the dike. The whole boat looked slippery and slimy with seaweeds and sea scum. It was crusted all over with strange, rotted growths. Big crabs scurried under the boat. It was so still here, Lina could hear the scuttling, clicking movements of the hard-shell crabs. Snails and other slow, slimy sea animals clung and moved everywhere among the weeds and rotted wood. Lina walked around the boat once again. There was only one way to get up on it. An old anchor chain still hung at the stern. It was as coated and slimy as all the rest. If she clung to the chain and pulled herself up by it, she could sort of walk up the rounded stern, if she took her wooden shoes off. Lina considered. She really should take her socks and stockings off, too, but the thought of climbing the crusted boat with her bare toes among the slime and scum and moving things gave her cold horror. She'd just take her shoes off. But when she set her shoes on the dry sea bottom, they looked so tiny and helpless and out of place in the big sea that Lina felt wretched. She couldn't leave them behind. On sudden impulse, Lina pulled the ribbon out of her hair, strung it through 2 holes in the sides of her wooden shoes, and hung the shoes around her neck by the ribbon. Then, shutting her eyes tight, she grabbed the coated chain and, bracing her feet flat against the stern of the boat, hoisted herself up. It was far easier than she had expected. Lina was on the boat. She stood surprised and pleased. She looked about her proudly, wishing that somebody could have seen her. Yella thought only boys could climb and jump. If it wasn't for skirts and dresses, she thought, she could outclimb big, heavy Yella any old day. Oh, but it was quiet here. She wished now the heron had stayed. Lina hurriedly undid the ribbon from her shoes and put them back on. She left the ribbon around her neck. Her hands were too dirty for her to put the ribbon back in her hair. She immediately felt much better with her shoes on. She moved carefully forward, feeling her way over the slippery boat bottom among the tiny, scurrying animal insect things. There was a hole in the boat. A square hole had been cut in the bottom of the upside-down boat. But whatever for? Lina edged carefully toward the yawning hole, dropped to her knees, and queasily peered down. There was utter darkness and silence below, except for the small, faint sounds of crab scuttlings. Gradually, Lina's eyes became used to the darkness. Suddenly, she thrust herself deep into the hole, head and shoulders, her eyes trying to pierce the darkness, trying to make sure. It wasn't. It couldn't be. It was a wheel. Lina pulled her head out of the hole and glanced about her, blinking in the sunlight. Her mouth went partly open as if to shout the news to someone, but there was no one, and now in the stillness and sunlight she couldn't believe it herself anymore. She must have imagined it in the darkness. Once more she plunged head and shoulders into the hole and hung down as far as she dared. It was so. It was a wheel. It was all but swallowed up in sea silt, but she could see part of a spoke, a little section of rim, and the big hub jutting up out of the silt. A wagon wheel was under an old, forgotten, turned-up boat. It couldn't be, but it was. Lina jumped to her feet. She danced a little dance all around the hole, forgetting of slime and slipperiness. She sang a little song in the stillness of the sea, danced and sang. It seemed to be the same song she had sung to the watchdog. It still had no meaning. It still made no sense. But now it was happy. The song stopped abruptly in Lina's mouth. She stood still. Someone was watching her from the dike. It was old Dalva, and this was Dalva's boat, Lina knew. But she hardly knew old Dalva. Dalva lived in Shara, but you seldom saw him, because every day old Dalva took long walks along the dike, as far even as the village of Ternod. It took him all day, but the next day he would do it over again. Old Dalva was 93. Now Dalva was shouting at her from the dike, but Lina on the boat couldn't understand his hoarse old voice. "What did you say?" Lina called across the dry stretch of sea bottom. And then each word came slowly to her. Dalva was shouting them back one by one. "Little girl, why were you dancing on my boat?" "I found a wheel! I found a wheel!" Lina cried back at him. "Oh, sure, but that's been there some 80 years. It overwhelmed Lina. She had to sit down. Imagine it. And Dalva had shouted it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A wheel in a boat for 80 years? And all the time, old Dalva had known. And all the time, through the search by the whole school, anyone could have gone up to him and said, "Dalva, where can I find a wheel?" And he would have replied, "Oh, under my boat." But who would have thought of asking Dalva? Dalva was almost 100 years old.